I'd now like to turn things over to today's moderator, Chris Bowen, Founder and Chief Privacy and Security Officer at ClearDATA.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks to all of you for spending a few minutes with us on a Tuesday. We think today you're going to have a great opportunity to hear from some really important leaders in the space of healthcare analytics as well as infrastructure. Before we start, I just wanted to go into a couple of statistics around the healthcare analytics market. It's a fairly large market, and it's just getting bigger. $42.8 billion market opportunity by the year 2024. So as we start to see workloads and programs focusing on things like chronic disease management and wellness, our panel will start to describe how they have applied machine learning and predictive analytics to some of these challenges, especially as the Accountable Care Act has moved us into an outcomes-based model in healthcare where data is actually a very important part of making sure that the people who go through our system come out of it with the desired result. So some of the top programs, it's kind of interesting to see that chronic disease management is one of the top focal points of analytics. David and Mark will both talk to you more about that as we get into the details. But it's a very fascinating topic as it relates to our healthcare delivery in the United States. As we go to the next slide, there are a couple of challenges that are inherent in healthcare analytics. One of those challenges still remains is an interoperability challenge. One set of data talking to another set of data. There's been some remarkable improvements in database technologies where unstructured data can now be applied in a way that allows for greater interoperability. At the same time, you've got a lot of great advancements in cloud models that allow interoperability to further progress. And we'll talk more about how to build an agile infrastructure in the cloud to enable some of the analytics workloads and solutions. Other challenges with analytics is a skills gap. The skills necessary to enable a proper analytics program, to make it useful to the outcome of a patient's health, it's difficult to find the right skills. And this is really inherent with any type of new emerging trend in technology and data, where now you've got job descriptions called data scientist, for example, and you hear things about machine learning and other types of approaches. Some of the best are the names of the technologies that we see. Hadoop, for example, is a great tool for some of these challenges as well. But finding the talent to enable all of this still remains a challenge. And then, of course, another final challenge is how do you make sure that the data is protected? How do you make sure that when you're sharing data, when you're moving data back and forth to a group of community-based physicians, for example, how do you make sure that the privacy requirements are upheld by the patients? And so that remains one of those existing challenges as well, and it's getting better. It's just that there are a couple of challenges we wanted to identify. Now, public cloud, as we've all seen, the stock price of Amazon climb through the ceiling, and we've seen massive investments by others like Google and Microsoft Azure. The public cloud can play a critical role in the healthcare analytics role. It's helping to modernize the infrastructure. It's helping to consolidate and centralize data environments, and it's also helping to ensure and make available at scale greater tools for security and compliance. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel. David Bennett is with Orion Health. He's the EVP of Product and Strategy. David's doing some amazing things over at Orion Health in the machine learning and the predictive analytics space. He's been an entrepreneur in the technology arena for over 20 years. He's been on the board of Axway, iSirona, Medisense, MIT Enterprise Forum, et cetera. He actually joined Dr. Patrick Schuchwang with the formation of Orion Health and new predictive models of care. The next person on our panel is a gentleman named Mark Hillier. Mark Hillier has been in healthcare for a very long time. He currently is the president and CEO of Equality Health, and he is really the voice of the customer. He has been at the forefront of building clinically integrated networks and using analytics to drive patient outcomes for a very long time. And someone's got a little background noise. If they could mute, that'd be great. Sorry about that. Mark has previously worked for Dignity Health, where he was COO of the Arizona Care Network, as well as eventually leading that group. And I know Mark from a long time ago, where we hired him and his firm to do a turnaround for a public health system at Maricopa County in Arizona. So he's an expert in his field, and he's great. The next one is a gentleman I get the privilege of working with. Adam is a pioneer in emerging technologies. He has helped drive ClearDATA's technical direction and product development strategy. He's got a lot to say around containers, around microservices, around how to build an agile infrastructure in the cloud. He brings a wealth of knowledge around orchestration and process as well. So I'd like to thank all three of our panelists for joining us today. Why don't we go ahead and get started with our first question? And this is really a question for David and Mark. What type of analytics solutions, and I'll go to you first, David, what types of analytic solutions are healthcare organizations moving to in the cloud right now? What are some real-world examples?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've been working with payers, providers, and pharmaceutical in this area, and they're moving everything from real-time analytics to retrospective to predictive analytics to the cloud. Initially, you thought that they would only focus on real-time and maybe predictive just because of the compute power, but we're seeing all those patterns, and some examples of that are focusing on gaps in care in real time, focusing on how my network's performing from a retrospective perspective, cost analysis from a retrospective perspective, and then we're also seeing the predictive analytics using genome data and biometric data to actually predict exacerbations before they occur. And we're seeing models using predictive models to understand readmission risk and admission risk. So we're seeing all three patterns deployed in the cloud at scale now, which a couple of years ago I'd say that wasn't true.
That's an interesting point, David. And Mark, I know you've been around the block on these types of use cases before as a customer. What are you seeing that's happening in the real world, and why do you think that public cloud is becoming more and more accepted, as David mentioned?
Yeah, I think David touched on a lot of things. From an end user perspective, we look at all things that would enhance population health. So chronic disease management, David mentioned gaps in care. We're even looking at loading health risk assessments that have a overlay of cultural risk assessments into the cloud, so that when we go to the end user, the physicians and the care teams, we actually have real-time and the retrospective, but real-time information that enhances decision-making at the time of care.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, Mark mentioned some good points there, though, because the combination of having real-time and retrospective and affecting what the care plans look like from from a behavioral and a risk scoring perspective is driving a lot of change in the payer and provider space right now.
So that's all great stuff. How does the cloud help you enable those real world examples?
I can answer that first.
Well, from my perspective, the cloud is nimble. It allows the transfer of information a lot faster than if you had your own in-house data experts. I think the cloud has a lot more flexibility. Dave, what do you think?
Yes, it's when you're integrating data from lots of different sources, it provides the natural kind of hub to do that, and it gives you the capability to share that data in a community context. And as we shift to more proactive care models, like what Mark's working on, you're going to need access to this data and a point of view to this data across the entire continuum, from patient to payer to care manager to provider, and the cloud is the perfect hub for that. In addition, the cloud is well suited for a lot of the new advanced analytics, predictive analytics, where I could spin up a machine learning library or a R or a SAS library to actually generate some predictive analytics over 50 nodes and then spin them down. So my compute cost goes way down because I have this elastic capability built into it. So not only is it flexible and agile, like Mark said, but it adds this community hub context to it that requires really something in the middle to share this data and provide the point of view to the right participants in the community.
That's an interesting point, David. And Mark, I'll go back to your experience a little bit. I know from working with you in the past that large systems will sometimes help subsidize some of the information sharing among clinically connected physician groups and other providers. Some of the objections that I've seen is, hey, if this big system is subsidizing this exchange of information, well, maybe I don't want my data in that big system, and so they've kind of gone to a neutral third party to help manage that data. Have you seen that play out in your experience in the recent past, Mark?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's a whole lot of concern about sharing information with the big health systems. But I really think that that might be unwarranted. I think sharing information is critical to the success of achieving the goals of the AAA. And so the health information exchange is independent and is shared by all. The big systems are also sharing their data. So I think the more data that we can turn into information quickly using the cloud should assuage anybody's fears of how their data is shared.
So thanks, Mark. David, let's go back to that point, which is really about security and privacy. What kind of security measures do you think are necessary for healthcare organizations to safely manage, protect their analytic solutions in a public cloud environment?
Well, it's just like any data, any PHI data. Obviously, you need to make sure it's secure in transit, secure at rest. You have to make sure that the way you deploy that technology, there's compliance up and down the stack. But one of the hardest things to do with analytics, and most of the audience would know this, is that when you're dealing with privacy services and relationships and understanding privacy services across your data acquisition layers to your care management layers to your analytics layers, how do you do that in a way where you keep them synchronized? So managing privacy services in those relationships is quite difficult because there's a synchronization problem. You have to make sure that, for example, in Mark's setting, we want to make sure that if we give Mark, for example, a panel of patients that he has to work on, that panel is specific to attributed to the physicians and the care managers responsible for that panel of patients. So having analytics that are real-time and managing gaps and quality measures and things like that, if you don't have a system that synchronizes privacy across all those services, from your workflows to your analytics to your acquisition and viewing of that data, even through APIs and portals, you're going to have challenges. So you have to really look at not just the security at the lower layer infrastructure layer, but also that privacy layer on top of the applications to make sure the relationships are managed well.
That's a lot of detail there, David. There's a lot of devil in the details on those statements. Adam, you get the privilege of helping to build some of the orchestration tools and enable some of the safeguards that David was talking about. From your perspective, what do you think some of these security measures need to be to safely protect these solutions in the cloud?
Well, I think we touched on several of them. I think the critical elements are rigor around the important best practices that have been the fundamental underpinnings of sort of secure computing since the beginnings, right? Encryption in transit, encryption at rest, understanding where your data flows and what has access to it where is critically important. The good news is, as technology advances, we have a whole host of new tools that aid us in doing so, and adopting a lot of the industry's emerging best practices around things like DevOps and infrastructure as code give you a great foundation to have that security and compliance baked in from the time infrastructure is spun up till the time it's destroyed. And also, as you reach a point where you're only running workload of an hour or 2 hours on a single instance and you can destroy them after that period of time, it alleviates a lot of the traditional concerns around patching and long-term security from people being able to get some sort of access to that part of the infrastructure, because all of these things can sort of come together and really provide effective frameworks to mitigate risk in ways that weren't realistic, just a few years ago with more traditional sorts of server resources.
Thanks, Adam. And so you mentioned a couple of great things there, and I know we've got some IT folks on the call. We've also got some high-level decision makers. Tell us what infrastructure as code is as it relates to managing a CloudWorks workload at a high level.
Sure. As we move into the virtual data center, the reality is that what we want for our operations teams looks a lot like what we wanted for our software developers for a long time. So instead of managing all of these things as sort of disparate resources, a lot of the emerging best practices tell us that we should manage these things effectively as manifest descriptions of themselves. So there's a number of different technologies out there, and there's merits to all of them. Frankly, we don't take a strong opinionated stance on which tool you should use, but what you're looking for is you want the ability to represent your entire infrastructure as a static artifact that you can use to either reproduce or audit that infrastructure or scan it for compliance to make sure it hasn't changed from what you expect. It's sort of defining the explicit plan for how the pieces of your infrastructure need to fit together, and then expressing that in a way that can be turned into actual running infrastructure in an automated fashion.
Yeah, it's great stuff. It's fun to watch that evolve from an industry perspective. David, let's go back to you from a privacy perspective for a minute. Let's think about what kind of factors a healthcare organization like Mark's should consider prior to moving their workload or their solution into a cloud environment. And then Mark, we'll come to you for your opinion as well.
Yeah, so when you think of privacy, you have to think of the types of participants that sit in a community context like Mark's responsible for. You have multiple payers typically and their data sets. You have multiple providers and their data sets. You have physicians and physician practices, and you have patients that might access this data, and care managers. And all of them have to get access to this data, they have to have some type of relationship with the data sets. So making sure you can control privacy across multiple payers. So, for example, payer Blue Cross Blue Shield of Arizona can't see United's claims information in a single system. So you're managing privacy across multiple payers. At the same time, you can, if you're a provider or a care manager, and you're managing patients that have either two payers or are managing both payers' patients, members, you need to be able to see all that data if you're the provider and you have a relationship with them. So managing all these different privacy policies get quite complex. And when you mix analytics with that, now you have to make sure that if I'm creating a cohort for chronic care management or preventative management for pre-chronics, whatever that cohort might be, you have to make sure those same privacy policies apply. You also have to make sure if a patient's accessing data, they're only accessing their data. So privacy services in general is quite complex and needs to be considered across the entire stack, not just the data acquisition and analytics, but also the workflows and the patient engagement. The other thing you need to think about is when you have situations where there are emergencies in ED and you want to deal with a patient that maybe has some restricted access to certain data attributes, if it's behavioral or STD related, you want to make sure that ED doc can actually break the glass, if you want to call it that, and view that data so they can make sure they're dealing with any prescription that this patient might be on that causes some adverse event or some drug-to-drug interaction problem. So really having systems that can track that, audit that, and control all those different privacy policies is critical across that entire stack, not just the acquisition, but the analytics, care management, engagement stack.
Well, that's great stuff, David. Thank you. Mark, what are your thoughts from your perspective?
David touched on a very complex situation, as you can imagine. From an end user perspective, we take what David just said for granted, right? We need all that privacy in place. A breach is the worst thing that could possibly happen. I think when looking for a vendor, you want to make sure that somebody has healthcare experience first, because if you're looking at somebody that has never done large cloud computing without healthcare experience, everything that David just said turns out to be a different language for them. I think I would touch on one thing in addition to what David said, and he said giving the patient access to that information. I think that is critical as well in how we protect and allow the patient to be engaged in their own healthcare is something that we don't talk about a whole lot. So I wouldn't want to lose focus on member engagement, patient engagement as well. So that patient portal and how we interact with each one of the physician portals and how that portal then interacts with the cloud data warehouse, if you will, is critical to getting member engagement.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Mark. Let's move on to the next kind of area here. We're going to talk a little bit more about infrastructure. And Adam, let's come to you now. What does it mean to build an agile infrastructure in the cloud? I know that's one of our buzzwords we all like to use, but tell us in real life, what does that actually mean?
Sure. I mean, more and more the challenge facing IT organizations, especially those servicing critical healthcare workloads, is that we need to have an infrastructure that is secure and compliant, but at the same time is the right size for the organization and the need at the moment. This can come in a couple forms. Advanced applications and infrastructure might actually, during the day, spin up and spin down server resources in an auto-scaling fashion based on the amount of workload coming into them. But even beyond that, it could be a situation where, it may be appropriate to spin up an entire ephemeral analytics farm to run a certain set of jobs and then to tear that farm down afterwards. Underpinning all of these great use cases that Mark and Dave have been speaking to is a lot of complex plumbing. And at the end of the day, what you want is you want your data scientists and your application level experts to be focused on these very, very important challenges that face the folks out there at all levels of the healthcare industry. And what we want to do is we want the infrastructure to become something that is responsive to the needs of those folks solving those problems. So wherever possible, building infrastructure that can monitor metrics to enable it to make decisions on spinning up and spinning down resources without operators needing to intervene, and making sure that all of these systems are constantly monitored against best practices for security, as well as across a whole host of aspects for compliance, aggregating all these massive logs that Dave and Mark were speaking to. As you have all these different areas where privacy is of concern, you want great visibility into those things. And furthermore, you don't just want to have those logs, but in some cases you want to be able to do things with them. The ability to build out complex processing pipelines to respond to exceptional behavior and detect bad patterns of access are critical as we face, emerging new threats from incredibly complex, attackers out there, and healthcare private information being so valuable to those attackers. It's something that you need to be concerned about from the application level all the way down to the bare metal.
Chris,
Yeah,
I'd like to add a little bit. So one of the things that we didn't mention was the additional complexity with behavioral health diagnoses. And so I'm sure that Dave and Adam can talk about that, but that is so critical to the physician and the care teams to have access to not just the medical, but the behavioral complications that a patient presents with. And everything that we're talking about, infrastructure, has to be easy to use at the end user site, because if it's not easy to use, it delays the whole process and the whole practice, whether it's in the emergency room or in the physician's office, slows down too much. And so all of this complexity has to be boiled down, synthesized down to something that's easy to use.
Yeah, I echo that one, Mark. Thanks for bringing that up, because there's nothing worse than trying to treat a patient when you have to log into 16 different systems going down the hallway to try to read their chart. And ultimately security suffers from poorly designed experience, for sure. David, Adam mentioned a lot of really amazing types of things to think about from an agile infrastructure. You've built a share of your own in the market space. Anything you would add to what it means to have an agile infrastructure in the cloud?
Yeah, it really, I mean, when you think about trying to control costs for your customers at some level, having the capability to spend things down in off hours and having the capability in the analytics context spin up of 50 nodes to run some machine learning library to do some predictive analytics and then shut it down really drives that, total cost of ownership down for our customers. So deploying it in those environments where you have the capability of this elastic kind of compute, but also, if a customer wants to, we're working with some customers right now that want to give us some non-PHI data and put it in a de-identified AWS environment, you can spin those up very, very quickly for them, and they can do some tests with non-PHI data quickly to understand how their applications might work with our APIs and our analytics framework. So having that kind of flexibility and agility in that environment lets our customers move quicker and support new kinds of compute much faster at a total cost of ownership that's much less than them doing it on-prem or in their own data center.
Yeah, it's interesting that the genesis of AWS, the web services, really came about when they started to analyze what kind of needs they have during the holiday shopping season, and their instances would spin up automatically based on some historical data. So very interesting now how we're applying some of those patterns to healthcare workloads. You talked about auto-scaling and how we can architect a system that won't break the bank. Mark, let's go back to your past for just a few minutes, where you've been responsible for deploying data centers. And let's talk about just briefly, some of the challenges that you see with on-premise types of data centers where they're trying to build something for massive spikes. What does that do to your P&L or to your bottom line as a healthcare organization?
Yeah, so I was doing this, you said earlier how old I was in this market. So I've been doing this before the cloud computing, I think, even came around. And the cost of doing this in-house is quite expensive. And I'm not really talking about the hardware software costs, the ongoing labor costs, and to make sure that you have the skill set amongst the people that you hire. The cost is it's exorbitant to build this internally versus knowing it's in the cloud and you have the skill sets of the people in the cloud and the scalability to change you're more nimble in the cloud as well. So my experience of building this in-house is a very expensive proposition.
Yeah, I think I've seen a few budget requests in my very distant past on some of those same topics. But let's go now over to Adam. I mean, we talk about building an architecture that won't break the bank. Adam, how can you help, or how can a good cloud architecture help avoid those, massive amounts of resources that you don't need? Tell me what's in the details. How do we make that bridge from architecting for the highest possible use to almost a just-in-time kind of compute storage network type of scenario? How do we do that?
Sure. So for most organizations, it's a process. I would say just in the last 9 months, we started to see some surprisingly large organizations across the provider and payer space start to look seriously at how they can adopt some of these new emerging best practices and get some of the benefit cost-wise. In many cases, it does require us to change how we're doing what we do a little bit, but when you deal with technology that is as adaptive as the technology we've been talking about today, you have the ability to separate concerns and effectively control cost for each area of your infrastructure. So you separate the sort of storage concern and use some of the secure storage services that are available as a baseline that make dealing with these large quantities of data that previously would have been absolutely massive problems to back up and audit on an ongoing basis. And And then you add the compute components as necessary, as we were talking about. Mark talked about spinning up and spinning down workload throughout the course of sort of working in just day-to-day challenges for most organizations in the space. That can be a game changer, and it can also be a game changer from a cost perspective, because if you're only paying humans that sort of very expensive labor cost that we were talking about to work on a problem for 8 hours a day, then the supporting compute infrastructure should be able to spin down for the same period of time that you don't have anyone that would be using it. So those sorts of things are massively beneficial when you talk about just-in-time computing and this utility computing model that's really become common in the public cloud space, of paying for just the hours you need to use computing resources.
Thanks, Adam. David, let's come to you for a few minutes on how to reduce deployment times for new analytic initiatives without cutting corners or putting data at risk. How have you guys mastered that in the industry?
Well, fortunately, we cut our teeth on probably the two critical areas that really actually help analytics work. I mean, I don't know how much you know about us, but we have an interface engine called Rhapsody that's in 1,000 hospitals around the world. So we've been doing interface work and integration work for 15, 20 years. And then we've been doing that data aggregation around the world. In fact, we have 102 million longitudinal patient records in our systems around the world, entire countries. So we've been doing both the interface work and the aggregation work. Those two layers are absolutely critical to make analytics work well. And Mark and others will tell you this, that if you don't have good data or quality data at some level, you really can't get to the point of managing these patients in a proactive kind of real-time model where we're going from a market perspective and where we're going with predictive medicine. So for us, it's really focusing on, those layers of aggregation and integration, getting those nailed so you can provide great analytics back to your providers and payers and patients in near real time. So I think we as an industry tend to, it's probably I started my own company in '96, and we became the leaders in B2B integration, and we sold it to every industry, and every industry has operationalized integration. They all have standards, but standards don't solve the problem. It really requires operationalizing integration, and that's hard work. And our industry in general has not spent the time or the money to do that. So that's a big part of what you have to do to actually get to great analytics. And I think no matter who you talk to, they'll ask you, hey, having good curated data will be the key to getting great analytics. So, and that stuff is not easy. And if anybody tells you it's easy, they haven't done integration or aggregation. But we can do it. Other industries do it, and we can do it.
That's a key point, David. And I think when you're talking about lots and lots of data, certainly our friends across the cyber pond, if you will, have taken notice and are really doing their best job to try to steal some of that data. So Adam, coming back to a point that you and I have talked about in the past, when you have massive amounts of data and you see certain state actors or bad guys steal 80 million records at a time, what are some of the strategies we can employ in the cloud to help prevent some of those kinds of challenges or some of those kinds of opportunities, particularly around maybe a microservice strategy or a container type of strategy?
Sure. So as you look at the microservice infrastructures that are becoming popular and sort of being deployed in a lot of industries, not just in healthcare, but in many other spaces as well, you have a whole set of new tools you can use as well in the toolbox effectively to mitigate access risks. In many cases, you can use ephemeral credentials that are short-lived. So when these microservices need to have access to something, they have very specific access to the parts of the infrastructure they need, and in some cases, the specific areas or parts of the patient record that they need to have access to. In some cases, this is achieved through changes to the application. In other times, we're seeing a lot of the very, very popular enterprise-grade software used in the healthcare space integrate more and more of this cloud-native technology. And then with that, you get a whole new set of data feeds you can use to analyze and look for access patterns and potentially audit for security and compliance reasons to make sure that you're living up to your requirements with regard to the protection and the control of use of that data. So those sorts of patterns are becoming common conversations with folks in the space that we're talking to.
I think it's interesting, Adam, how you have described having access to just a piece of the patient record, maybe not the whole data set. Maybe somebody's not able to execute a SQL query against an entire database, but maybe those credentials help only allow access for a short period of time, maybe only to a specific part of a history, for example. So just fascinating stuff, in my opinion. So thank you. Okay, so Mark, let's come back to some key considerations here. From your perspective, what are the top 3 criteria that healthcare organizations might want to consider when they are choosing a healthcare service, or a cloud service provider? I think you mentioned healthcare experience in the past dialogue, but any others come to mind?
I think you want to look at the client list as well, so that will show healthcare experience. But you want to make sure you cover everything that we've talked about here today, and go beyond the BAA, get into the whole security. Where does the data reside? Who has access to it, and that sort of stuff. But I guess the third thing that I would look at is the timeliness, the response, and the performance of the data set. So I would ask some of the clients if they were happy with the response times and how fast information was refreshed. That information, I think David touched on it, is really important, that not only is it fast and easy to use, as I said before, that it's accurate. If the physicians or the care teams are getting information that they don't believe, then it will never be used. So we have to earn our stripes, if you will. We have to prove that the data is comprehensive and accurate, and it's, your patient data is aggregated properly. So you're going to find that sort of information out through reference checks as well. But I think you hit it first. Healthcare experience, security, and performance would be the top 3 that I would say.
Mark, David, you've been put through the paces on vendor diligence before when you are entertaining a potential customer. What are some of the patterns you've seen in terms of how they've wanted to, what factors they want to consider when putting some solutions in the cloud?
It's pretty interesting. We have large payers and large providers, and even working with some medical device manufacturers and a couple other new spaces. And they vary a little bit by the space, but some of the payers, because of the hacks that occurred in those industries, have put us through the ringer. They'll send 10 to 12 people out and do a full audit on every one of our systems for about 3 or 4 days, 5 days at the most. And they're checking everything. In fact, we even bring in AWS, so AWS can talk about how we're architected. And I don't know if people know about this stamp of not approval, but the stamp of that AWS puts on vendors. We have this stamp called well architected. So we work very close with them on how to make sure we're secure in their HIPAA environment and make sure that we're following all the right processes and procedures. And so it's a really interesting process that we go through with these customers. And in the pharmaceutical space, you start seeing some other things around 21 CFR Part 11 and just all different types of requirements you see. So it varies by customer, and we invest a tremendous amount on that side because it's just as critical to our business as it is to theirs. So in fact, we probably invest more than they do. And typically, the results we get back are, if we need to adjust some things, we adjust them, but typically we actually are stronger than them from a security perspective, just because we have outside SOC service providers and other types of things that we put into place. And I'm not trying to sell us, but if you go down this path, you have to make sure that you have the right security compliance processes in place and the right technology, and it has to be architected right.
Yeah, hear, David. I've gone through a few of those audits myself, and you're right. They're very prescriptive on what they want to examine. So thank you for that.
And I think they're good.
So
I think they're good, Chris. They're good for us. I mean, they make
yeah.
all of us better. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit a great point, which is, the cloud does offer the ability to allow you to scale in a way that a single organization may not be able to by bringing to bear some of these great solutions that are out there. And the cost can be spread among, many, many customers instead of just one cost center and a P&L. So great. So Adam, let's come to you, and we'll kind of wrap it up, and we'll maybe go around the table here in a few seconds here. But beyond some of the obvious ones, Adam, what are some of the benefits and what are some of the risks in working with a public cloud provider?
Sure. So it's very important when you move into these incredibly complicated infrastructures that you have someone with the experience that we've been talking about today. I think both of the other panelists spoke to it very well. Doing cloud for healthcare is unlike doing cloud for anything else. So it's very, very important that whomever you choose to deal with, be it a provider or a systems integrator, they have a track record of doing this for companies that are comparable to your own. So ask those questions, vet those references, certainly do your homework in that regard. Beyond that, you want to be dealing with someone who is looking at the changes that are forthcoming in a way that they're making investment in new technology. You really don't want to be implementing something that is unlikely to stand the test of time, so you want to have people looking at changes that come out within all of the technology platforms involved, because many of these are very complex, growing, living organisms when we talk about public cloud provider platforms. And you can certainly do all these things with staff internally, but one of the things that you really need to ask yourself is, does that drive core business value for my organization? Is that something that adds to our ability to serve patients or to sort of function as an organization towards our core business values? And in many cases where that doesn't make sense, there's a host of organizations and options out there to help. They provide all sorts of services from, in some cases outsourcing the entire application, in the SaaS provider world, all the way down to people that will come in and consult with you to help you understand how to build better microservice applications and sort of everything in between. So leverage the expertise that exists, and certainly keep security and compliance in mind from day one. Don't make it an afterthought, and don't assume that just because something isn't production today that it's never going to be production. Start in the cloud like you're serious, and not like this is some sort of one-off experiment, and you're going to have a much better experience. So that would be sort of my advice in general, Chris.
I appreciate that, Adam. Mark, let's maybe come to you for any last words, any advice, any lessons to remember, and then David will come to you after.
Well, I think we've covered a whole lot of things here. The privacy is one that keeps a lot of us up at night. Having it in the cloud is, with a proven entity, is very helpful, at least for my sleep. So the thing that I want to stress is security. And if you have staff that are pulling down information, you have to make sure that that information is not stored on your servers as well, because it's very easy to do a breach. So I really think it's best to have an expert in the field as your cloud service provider, and have all the computing power in the cloud in that protected fashion. I think that will help your company in the long run.
Thanks, Mark. David, final words from you.
Yeah, it's 3 years ago or so, or even more, I remember talking to large payers and providers, and they weren't that interested in the cloud. And now I talk to many of these CXOs, CIOs, CMOs, CMIOs, and their whole strategy is wrapped around cloud. So they're starting to believe that it's more secure. It gives them the agility we talked about and the elastic kind of capability, and it probably de-risks their current environments a little bit. And when you're looking at analytics, the cloud is so well suited for that, because that total cost of ownership is always going to be a lot less in the cloud environment, especially when you're talking about the new, more advanced analytics. And as Chris mentioned in his first slide, data is going to drive healthcare, and it's going to drive it from a consumer base, from a proactive care model around value-based contracts, and from precise medicine using omics, behavioral data, social environment data. So as we become more data-driven as an industry, compute analytics is going to be key, and the cloud is going to be the only way to do it.
Thank you, David. And thanks to Mark and Adam as well. We appreciate having all three of you on the panel today. We had one question from the audience. It was an interesting international question. This is a gentleman from Saudi Arabia, where he said, he asked whether we have any large multiple vendor PHI environments deployed together on the public cloud. I'm not aware, or I don't know of any, particularly with the country of Saudi Arabia. But it would not surprise me if there were international data flows and such with Saudi Arabia. Does anybody else have any insight on that question?
We actually have customers in the Middle East, and some of them are starting to deploy population health-based management systems, which do have multiple vendors in a single cloud. It might be a specific country based, if it's UAE or Qatar or different locations. It might be a specific data center that's healthcare certified, but we are seeing many of those Middle East countries looking at shifting to more PHM solutions because of some of the chronic issues around diabetes and COPD and other disease states. So I think that's a big movement in those areas, and you will see multiple vendors in a single cloud. And if you have the right microservices, I think that Adam and everybody was talking about, we have a privacy service that does that. You can manage it across multiple vendors and multiple applications.
Thank you, David. Another question is really an interesting one. It's around cognitive computing. How will cognitive computing affect the move to the cloud, in your opinions, anyone?
I'll take a shot if you want me to take a shot. This is real close to my heart. I have a son with cystic fibrosis, and he is one of the fortunate few. 4% of the kids, CF kids, have a specific mutation that there was a drug specifically designed for him, and basically it corrects some of the protein channels, so it helps a kid like with CF really extend his life, and it's been a game changer for him. He used to go in the hospital every 3 to 4 months. Now he goes there he hasn't been in hospital once in 4.5 years. Got to play football his last 3 years of high school. So it's a great story of precise medicine. But the reality is my doctor, and I have a good CF doctor here in Arizona, didn't have the cognitive support to actually provide the right care to my son. I had to tell him about the variation and make sure that he was on the right therapies. And it's not fair to our docs. We have systems today that are designed to handle ordering and billing, and not necessarily systems that are designed to help them at the point of care. If they're seeing a patient every 7 to 10 minutes, they really need these real-time systems that say, hey, this patient has this variation, you should put them on this therapy versus the other therapies that the other CF kids have. We have the capability of doing this. It's a matter of us investing in the things around analytics and aggregation and integration and operationalizing integration to actually really provide this cognitive support directly out to our providers and our patients. So I think the cloud is perfectly designed for that, because you have all this data that you have to aggregate and then actually provide that kind of real-time suggestion to the doctor to say, hey, consider this different drug because of this variation this patient has.
David, thank you for sharing that. And I'll leave just one thought before I pass it back to Patrick. Again, thank you, panelists, for being part of this. Those of you on the call who work every day in healthcare to try to solve these challenges, what David said really hits close to home, where this is what causes us to get up and go to work in the morning and try to solve these problems. It's trying to solve some of the real challenges that the patients face in the system. So again, thank you. Thank all of you for your questions. And Patrick, we'll go back to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And just to echo Chris's comments, thank you guys so much, our panelists today. A lot of great information. I know our audience appreciates that as well. And also, of course, thank you to our audience members for attending today. We do trust that you find this presentation educational. We do push out an exit survey as you exit the presentation. We do appreciate any feedback that you may have. We like to use that information to enhance the quality of our presentation. So any feedback that you may have, we would love to hear that as you leave today's presentation. Quick reminder, all of the registrants for today's webinar will receive an email in the coming days with a link to the replay of this webinar for you to view again or share with a colleague. So once again, everybody, thank you so much for your participation, and have a wonderful day.